With the growth of professional rugby worldwide, the demand to see games live on television is increasing year after year. To speak about the business side of rugby and broadcast rights, the Rugby Business Network is joined by Sales and Business Development Manager at IMG Media, Sam Stitcher. Sam, thank you for taking the time to provide us with some of your knowledge and expertise in this area.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Before we discuss the ins and outs of media rights and programming sales in rugby, it needs to be pointed out, Sam, that you played for Yorkshire Carnegie, Harlequins, London Wasps and Esher between 2005 and 2012. What were those years like, and is there one club in particular which stands out for you the most?
I kind of look back on it now and it feels like a long time ago. I said played for those clubs is probably a pretty loosely applied term. I was in the squads for all those clubs, but certainly at some of those top flight clubs I was a very willing and squad member, but I didn't spend as much time on the field as perhaps I would have liked. But look, I look back on those days with a huge amount of fondness, actually. I mean, I should add that I'm still playing now. I still play in Sydney for Eastern Suburbs. It was a hell of a lot of fun playing the game professionally. And I guess of those clubs, I think probably, moving up north to play for Leeds, as it was known at the time, but now Yorkshire Carnegie was probably the highlight for me. Mainly because that was kind of where I sort of, really kind of developed and moved away from being an academy player into becoming a first grade player.
Well, in 2009, the RFU Championship changed from a league consisting of semi-professional clubs to one that is now fully professional. What were some of the notable changes you experienced as a player going from semi-professionalism to the professional game of rugby?
The key transition, I suppose, was that these guys were able to be full-time professional players. And which it sounds like it's stating the obvious, but I guess what that really meant for the league was that there probably was greater demands placed on the guys in terms of the amount that they were required to train, both on the field and off the field. It had an impact really on the competition because there were really only a few teams that were able to keep pace with the development that was going on within the professional game, both on the field and off the field. To be honest with you, when I look back at it now, I think when the championship changed, I'm not sure really that was to the benefit of the league or necessarily the players that were playing the game at the time. The players that I played with at the time, that were, you'd have a combination in the championship of, top end players that were just moving out of playing the game professionally and starting to looking to get their careers going off the field. Young players that were looking to move to the next level, and then obviously some of those teams that were kind of pushing to get promoted to the top league. So I think it provided incentives when it was a semi-professional competition for players to play the game longer. And I'm not sure that necessarily exists now that it's a fully professional competition.
Very interesting. Well, in 2012, Sam, you moved to Australia and you are still there, busy playing rugby, as you mentioned, for Eastern Suburbs in the New South Wales Shoot Shield. Why did you move down under? Was it for rugby or for business?
A familiar story, probably. Englishman living in London and met an Australian girl. So that was probably the reason. The reason for the move at the time. But look, I mean, in all seriousness, I am actually an Australian. My mother's from Australia, so I've always had a passport. So it was kind of one of the things that I guess in the back of my head, I always thought might have been an opportunity, possibility at the time. And the opportunity came along as a result of my girlfriend at the time, and so that was kind of why I decided to make the move. But I would be lying if I didn't say that the stage that I was at in my career professionally and from a rugby point of view, that it wasn't a good time for me to have a fresh start and start all over again. So it was a lot of fun. I don't regret a moment of it.
Brilliant. Well, looking at the business side of your life now, Sam, what are some of your main responsibilities as Sales and Business Development Manager? And for those that may not know, what does IMG Media do as a company?
Yeah, right. So I'll start with IMG Media. So we're the world's largest independent producer and distributor of sports content. So essentially what that means is that I wear a couple of hats in my role. As far as distribution of content is concerned, I broker sports rights deals in my key markets, which are Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific Islands and Indonesia. So across a whole range of sports, I'll negotiate the sale of those rights to free TV networks, pay TV networks, other media platforms, and so on. The other hat that I wear is that I'm also responsible for acquisitions of content from Australia that we distribute to the rest of the world. My colleagues will be selling my equivalents based on in the UK, the US and other parts of the world will be distributing the sports rights and the content that I'm able to acquire from this market. So That'll be the rights of the key rights holders and sports events and federations that exist within Australia. And then I guess the final part of my business as well, that's slightly off a tangent and it sits outside of the core sort of IMG Media business to a certain degree, is a growing division within IMG, which is the IMG Gaming division. Mm-hmm. So I actually run all aspects of IMG's betting business across Asia Pacific as well. Mm. So it's quite a varied role, given that it's in sport, it's a lot of fun, as it kind of has to be, really. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it.
Absolutely. Well, I should have perhaps mentioned earlier on, Sam, that you will only be turning 31 years old on November 24th this year. However, already since 2009, you have been involved in business. How did you manage to juggle between playing rugby and working in the corporate world, and which one took priority for you?
Look, to be honest, I wouldn't have said that anyone necessarily took priority at the time. It was always just a given that I was going to continue playing rugby, really, until I can't really do it anymore. Because, at the same time as it being a game and a passion of mine and a hobby, it's also kind of given the amount of time that I've spent playing the game, it's kind of part of your identity as well, really. Mm. I'm also a pretty poor golfer, so it was never going to be a change of sport that I was looking for. In terms of balancing the corporate side of things, I mean, I was always aware, I guess, when I finished off playing the sport professionally when I was at Harlequins. You looked around the quality of the guys that were in the squad in that season that I was there, and I think pretty quickly if you're going to be Johnny Wilkinson or Chris Robshaw. And if you're not one of those guys, you really have to start thinking about what you're going to do off the field. It was a pretty natural thing for me to be looking to pursue. I probably had more time on my hands than some of the other guys that were in the starting team every week. And so it was something that I was kind of ready for. And there were opportunities for me to continue playing the game professionally, but I was pretty aware that probably would have been to the detriment of my professional career outside of the game. It was really the right time for me, and kind of through contacts that I made through the sport, I was able to find some opportunities for me to cut my teeth and to get myself banged about in a corporate environment. That meant that when the role came along within IMG that I was looking for, I was in a position to take it.
Well, going back to IMG Media, which are the largest independent producers and distributors of sports media, as you mentioned, please could you explain the process involved in obtaining broadcast rights to different types of sports and events?
The way to think of it, I guess, is there's a broad spectrum, and at one end of the spectrum is the representation model, which is the traditional sort of agency model that IMG is associated with. Not dissimilar to working as an agent on behalf of an athlete, really, which is that for some key sort of sports federations and event owners and rights holders, IMG will purely be their boots on the ground and will be in a position to advise them and consult to them on which deals they should do in the market. If you think about a major sports event like a Grand Slam tennis tournament, for example, they'll probably execute somewhere between 100 and 190 different broadcast contracts every year around the world. So the resource required in-house to do those deals is a pretty it's pretty extensive. So the network that IMG has of employees across the globe with the local market intelligence that we have kind of puts us in a good position to work as those companies' representatives. So what that would tend to mean at that end of the spectrum is that we would pay a commission for the deals that we put in place by those guys. At the other end of the other extreme, I guess, the other end of the spectrum would be situations where IMG actually owns sports. So recently, sort of over the last few years, we've kind of made some acquisitions, and I guess the UFC is probably the best example of that, which has been acquired by the Endeavour Group. And so those are rights that sit within our catalogue, I guess, that can't kind of be taken away from us. And then somewhere in the middle there is kind of where it gets a bit exciting, where there's a fair bit of risk associated with the game, which is for certain properties and generally in football is probably the area where this is most common, is you'll actually have to do your market research, buy rights in a competitive tender, and then look to broker deals to make a margin for the company.
And to follow up on that, Sam, looking at rugby in particular, how does IMG go about selling and distributing rights of games, both club and international, to various countries? Is it a straightforward or somewhat complicated process?
Look, it really varies depending on the market that you're talking about, to be frank with you. There's obviously markets where rugby is an incredibly significant sport and will receive significant viewership and has a large number of fans and a high level of participation. But then obviously on the other hand, there are a large number of countries where rugby doesn't really move the needle and doesn't have the tradition and the history amongst the sports viewing audience. So the strategy, I guess, in the market will vary pretty wildly. So we take kind of a bit of a bespoke approach to it, and that could be anything from balancing the commercial interests of the league or the rights holder or the federation against the requirement to ensure as broader reach for the content as possible.
Fascinating. Well, besides rugby, IMG has an extensive catalogue of programs that span over 100 sports, one of which includes mixed martial arts, as you touched on after acquiring the rights to UFC in 2016. Looking at the super fight between Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor in Las Vegas back in August this year, how did it work with the broadcast rights to this fight, as it was watched by millions of people across the globe, and how does pay-per-view television fit in with all of this?
It was a fascinating event. It was quite unprecedented, and it probably will never happen again for a number of reasons. But this was an event that globally drove a huge level of interest from non-sports fans through to boxing and MMA enthusiasts. Everyone was interested in the fight, and the press and the hype around it and the build-up was quite remarkable. And in fact, I think Dana White's on record as saying that the fight only came about because people wanted the fight to happen. There was press interest in it even before the dates were announced and the fight was confirmed. So, in terms of our role in that, we worked on behalf of Maymac, which was the company that was set up, and to put in place their deals outside of the USA. So what that really meant is that there were some markets that are pay-per-view markets, and there are other markets where obviously that's not applicable for various reasons dictated by time zone, just economies, strength of currencies and so on, price points in these different markets sort of dictates what the strategy would have been. On behalf of Mayweather, we put in place a large number of contracts across the globe. The ratings were quite phenomenal. The volume of pay-per-view buys, which are all sort of publicly available information that's been shared, it broke records for pay-per-view buys commercially and residentially in Australia, New Zealand, in the UK, and in the USA and Canada. So it was a pretty remarkable event, and was something quite special to be involved in.
I can only imagine. Well, going back to professional rugby now, Sam, attendance at stadiums in some countries is becoming less and less, as we have seen in the Super Rugby competition in recent years. Is this in any way being affected by the demand of fans wanting to rather stay at home or go to the pub to watch the game on TV instead of buying a ticket to watch a match at the stadium?
Look, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer, to be frank with you. You mentioned Super Rugby. I think there's a specific set of challenges associated with Super Rugby that perhaps don't exist in other parts of the world. So you kind of have to look at that in isolation, I think, when you're talking about the issues surrounding attendance and viewership for Super Rugby. I think what is clear is that rugby is still incredibly strong in the Southern Hemisphere. You only have to look at the quality of the national teams to see how strong it is. But at its heart, at its core, and this is my own opinion here, is rugby is a pretty tribal game, and it's pretty hard to galvanise that tribal support for teams when you're often talking about state franchises, or when your team is playing away from home out of the time zone for such a significant proportion of the year. So there clearly are some issues there that I think everyone accepts, and it's a challenge for Super Rugby to work for. But has the on-field product suffered? I'm not certain that it has. I mean, the New Zealand teams are incredibly dominant, but I think that would be the case regardless of who else is playing in the competition. There are difficult challenges to wrestle with, but I look around at my own backyard at the Shoot Shield, which I guess is the level below Super Rugby within Australia, and I see the level of interest that's growing year on year around our competition. The number of fans that are turning up, the number of kids that are running around at half time on the field during the big games and the TV games that are played down here, and I don't see that the propensity for fans to attend these matches decreasing. I think it's probably more just an issue that's associated with one particular competition, which I know that the various unions are working pretty hard to try and resolve.
That's true. Well, looking ahead now, Sam, in the future, broadcast rights for rugby competitions, will they become more in demand like football is, and what sort of impact could that possibly have on the sport as a whole?
It's an interesting question. Certainly in key Northern Hemisphere markets, rugby's in a very strong position as the game sort of continues to grow, and the strength of those top leagues in Europe I think that you're set to see those broadcast rights will increase in value year on year for as long as the viewership is there. And I don't see any signs of the interest waning in those competitions, but whether we're talking about the international game and the Six Nations, or whether we're talking about, the leagues and the top club competitions that exist up there. So I think the future and the outlook for rugby in those core markets is strong. If you were to take a long-term view, clearly there's other markets where there's the opportunity for significant growth as well. If you look at markets like the USA and so on, you see the interest that some broadcasters have shown in the real sort of key tentpole competitions like the Rugby World Cup. I think that there's certainly room for growth in those markets. There's been a bit of a shift as far as the media landscape is concerned that we're kind of all living through at the moment, which is the propensity for audiences to look for their content online rather than to watch television. So, or traditional television, whether that's and pay for pay TV subscriptions and so on. So that's a challenge that clearly all the sports leagues and rights holders in rugby will have to navigate through. But as long as rugby remains a product that people want to watch live, the outlook is pretty positive, I think.
Some interesting times ahead. Well, finally, Sam, the approach that you took to playing rugby and having a career in business at the same time is not seen very often with the professional rugby players in this day and age. For those that are serious about playing rugby as a career, should they only look into a career in business towards the end of their playing days, or should they try to get into a company of some sort early on in their rugby career and devote some time to both careers?
I think it really varies depending on the individual, to be perfectly honest with you. I was always interested in what was going on, in a corporate sense and away from the game. So for me, it kind of suited me pretty well, and I was pretty keen to do it as soon as possible, although not to the detriment of my playing career. I think for other people, they may choose that they want to come to it a bit later on. I think that what certainly is incredibly important is that you develop some sort of experience outside of the game, while you're playing. It's quite an interesting thing, to be honest with you. I mean, I absolutely loved playing the game when I was a professional, but when it's your only focus, it actually can become quite all-consuming at times. When I found myself in a position when I was playing semi-professionally and working, I think it kind of reminds you why you started playing the game in the first place, and actually started enjoying it a lot more probably in those later years. And that's probably why I'm still playing the game now, and you could arguably say I'm probably a better player now than I was at the time. So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all type of question to answer, unfortunately, but I'd certainly be recommending for these guys that they are proactively looking at other opportunities outside of the game and using the contacts and the level of interest that people have in their careers to their benefit.
It's a good recommendation to make. Well, Sam, thank you for providing our listeners with the opportunity to hear about this incredibly fascinating side to rugby and broadcast rights. The Rugby Business Network wishes you continued growth and happiness at both IMG and on the rugby field as a player.
Thanks.